I am not the hero of this story. I want to be plain about that from the start, because I'm the one telling it, and old men who tell stories have a habit of putting themselves somewhere near the center. My name is Walt Greer. I was a circuit judge for the Aldenmere District for 22 years, and I have spent the 11 years since my retirement watching the Yen property from my porch across the road, drinking coffee I let go cold, and minding my business, which is to say, minding everyone else's. I knew Harlan Rell before he was a man. I knew Cora Yen before she was a widow. And I knew her father, Jonas Yen, for the lying, proud, land-jealous old goat that he was. God rest him, and he will need God's help in that department. What happened between those two people is the only story worth telling from this corner of Delham Flats. I'll tell it straight. Cora was 26 when Harlan first rode onto the Yen property looking for seasonal work. Jonas had lost 2 hands to the silver mines up in Crevasse County, and the fall gather was coming, and a man willing to work cattle for wages rather than a cut was hard to find that year. Harlan Rell was 29, lean in the way that means hard use rather than hunger, with a quiet that some men confuse for slowness. Jonas was not a subtle man, but even he figured out inside a week that Harlan Rell was not slow. He stayed through the gather, then he stayed through the winter. By the time the ground thawed in March, he was running the north pasture and eating supper at the Yen table 3 nights a week. And Cora, who had been teaching the Delham Flats schoolchildren since she was 22 and had, by all accounts, concluded that the frontier produced no men worth her time, had stopped ending those suppers early. I watched it from my porch. I am not ashamed to say so. In 22 years on the circuit bench, I watched enough human misery to last me 4 lives. Watching 2 decent people figure out they might love each other was the finest entertainment Delham Flats had ever offered me, and I was not about to look away. By the following autumn, the whole county knew. Cora was not a woman who blushed or simpered. She had her mother's composure, which was the kind of composure that comes not from coldness but from knowing exactly who you are. She walked into town with Harlan on a Saturday, bought flour, bought sugar, and stopped to speak with Mrs. Haverstock, and anyone with eyes could see the way they stood together. Not pressed close, not performing. Just together, the way a fence post and its neighbor are together, independently grounded and stronger for the proximity. Jonas saw it too. Jonas Yen had built his opinion of Harlan Rell, the way he built most opinions, fast and without much material. Harlan came from Telford County, which Jonas considered poor country and poor people. Harlan had worked drive cattle rather than own them, which Jonas considered a permanent condition rather than a stage. Harlan had no family land, no inheritance, and the year before he arrived at the Yen property, had lost a season's wages backing a business venture with a man who turned out to be neither a businessman nor honest. The debt had been settled. The money was gone. Harlan had started over. Jonas never forgot a debt, even someone else's. He said nothing that first year. He was not entirely a fool. He knew what Harlan's work was worth, and he knew that running Cora off a man directly would cost him more than he'd gain. But I watched him. I watched him the way I'd watched defendants in my courtroom, the small calculations behind the eyes, the patience of a man who has decided to wait for the right moment. The right moment arrived in the form of a bad spring. The Rell operation, Harlan had taken on a small lease on the North Ridge by then, trying to build something of his own, lost half its young stock to a fever that came through in March. It was bad luck and nothing else. The same fever hit 3 other operations in the county. But Jonas walked those north pasture fences in April, counted what remained, and arrived at his calculation. He went to see Harlan on a Tuesday. I did not witness that conversation, but I know what was said in it, because Harlan told me 11 years later, sitting at my kitchen table with his hat in his hands, and his face the way faces get when they've been carrying something too long. Jonas told him that a man who couldn't hold a herd together couldn't hold a family together. That Cora deserved better than a man who was one bad season from being a hired hand again. That if Harlan had any decency, he'd leave before he ruined her standing in the county. Because whatever she felt now, a woman of Cora's caliber would not thank a man who kept her in debt country for the rest of her life. And then Jonas said the thing that did the most damage. He told Harlan that Cora had confided in him. That she was fond of Harlan, yes, but that she had concerns about the debt year, about his prospects, about whether the affection she felt was judgment or sentiment. That she had asked Jonas quietly, as a daughter asks a father, whether he thought Harlan was the right match. And Jonas told him that he'd advised her to be honest with herself. It was a lie, every word of it. Cora had said nothing of the kind. But Jonas had spent 22 years watching how men behave when they believe a woman has doubts about them, and he knew exactly what that lie would do to a proud man with a buried shame about a debt year. Harlan was gone inside a week. He left no letter, no explanation. He settled his remaining debts in Aldenmere, sold the lease on the North Ridge, and rode south. Cora woke one Wednesday morning, went to the North Ridge to bring him the noon meal she'd taken to bringing him, and found an empty camp and a cold fire. Jonas told her Harlan had simply gone, that some men aren't built for staying, that she was better off knowing now. I did not know Jonas had lied until much later. I knew Cora's face when she came home from that North Ridge. I'd seen that face before in my courtroom, on people who had been told a verdict they hadn't expected. The face of someone rearranging everything they thought they knew. She didn't cry, not where anyone could see her. She went back to the schoolhouse the following Monday and taught arithmetic and letters and the names of rivers, and she kept the Yen Ranch running, and she did not speak Harlan Reo's name in my hearing for 11 years. Jonas died in the fall of the 7th year, leaving the property to Cora outright. By then she was 37, and Delham Flats had long since stopped expecting her to remarry. She had her composure and her schoolhouse and her 40 head of cattle and me across the road, and she seemed to have decided that was sufficient. She was sufficient to herself. That was the thing about Cora Yen. She did not require rescue. She required the truth, and that was a different thing entirely, and the one thing no one in Delham Flats had given her. I found out about Jonas's lie in the 8th year, going through a box of his papers that Cora asked me to look over for anything legally significant. Circuit judges retire. Their usefulness with paperwork does not. In among the land deeds and the water rights correspondence, I found a letter Jonas had drafted and never sent, to a land buyer in Telford County, asking whether one Harlan Reo had been located in that district, and instructing the buyer to confirm, if asked, that Reo had left owing a significant sum. Jonas had been tracking him, making sure he stayed gone. I sat with that paper for a long time. Then I folded it and put it back in the box and went home and sat on my porch and thought about what a man in my position, a retired judge, not a meddler, a man who respects other people's lives, was supposed to do with information like that. I thought about it for 3 years. I am not proud of those 3 years. I told myself Cora was fine, which she was. I told myself it was old business, which it was. I told myself she wouldn't thank me for dredging it, which she might not have. These are the things we tell ourselves when we already know what the right thing is and are simply not ready to do it. What moved me in the end was not a moral calculation. It was an October morning, 3 years into my sitting with that knowledge, when I watched Cora Yen walk across her yard to check the fence line, alone, in the early light, the way she walked every morning, and I thought, she made a life on a lie. She deserves to know the ground she's standing on. I wrote a letter to Telford County, then to 3 other counties south, then to a former colleague on the circuit who had wider contacts than I did. It took until February, but I found him. Harlan Reo was 51 years old when I wrote to him. He had drifted south for 3 years after leaving Delham Flats, worked drives in 2 territories, and eventually settled in Cavell County, where he ran a small freighting operation with a partner. He had not married. He had not, as far as I could determine, done much of anything beyond working and keeping to himself, which is a particular kind of life that particular kind of man lives when he has decided he doesn't deserve better. I wrote him a single letter. I told him I had been Jonas Yin's neighbor. I told him Jonas was dead. I told him I had found a document that suggested Jonas had not been truthful with him about certain matters, and that if he wished to know more he could write to me. I did not tell him what the lie was. I was a judge for 22 years. I know how to say enough and not too much. He wrote back inside a month. Then he wrote again. We exchanged 6 letters over 4 months, and I told him, piece by piece, what I knew. He arrived in Delham Flats on the 2nd Tuesday of November, 11 years to the month since he'd left, on a gray horse that had seen better days and with a coat that had seen considerably worse. He had the same quiet that some men confuse for slowness. It was not slowness. He came to my porch first. I appreciated that. I had been the one to find him, and he was the kind of man who understood what that meant. He stood at the foot of my porch steps with his hat in his hands, a habit I would come to see, and he said, I don't know what she knows or what she wants. I'm not here to put anything on her. I just needed to come back and find out if there was anything worth asking for. I told him to sit down. We talked for 2 hours. I told him everything I knew about the 11 years he'd missed, Jonas's death, the property, the schoolhouse, Cora's life. I told him she had not spoken his name in my hearing, which told him nothing except that she was Cora Yin and would not have. I told him I had not told her I'd found him, because that decision was not mine to make. I told him that if he went across that road, he was going of his own will, and whatever came of it was his to carry. He nodded, he thanked me, he put his hat on. Then he sat there another 10 minutes, not moving, looking at the Yin property across the road, and I watched a man gather everything he had and decide it was enough to try with. He stood up, shook my hand, and walked across the road. I did not hear that first conversation. I am going to be honest about that, because I have been honest about everything else, and I won't take credit for witnessing what I only partially saw. I watched from my porch. I saw Cora come to her door. I saw her go still in the way she went still, not with surprise, but with the particular stillness of someone who has been prepared for something without knowing they were being prepared. I saw her face, which told me nothing and everything. I saw Harlan standing at the bottom of her porch steps with his hat in his hands. They were out there for a long time. At some point she let him inside. At some point she did not. He was back at my place before dark, sleeping in my spare room, looking like a man who had expected to be hit and had been told instead to come back tomorrow. Which was, I understood, the worst and best possible response. It meant she hadn't closed the door. He came back tomorrow, and the day after. He did not push. That was what I watched in those first 2 weeks and what surprised me, because I had known hard men in hard situations tend to push. Harlan did not push. He came in the morning and asked if there was work that needed doing, and when there was a fence post, a cord of wood, a section of roof on the barn that had been leaking since August and that Cora had patched twice and that kept coming back, he did it. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't linger. He did the work and he left. The 3rd day she came out and watched him work. She didn't speak. He didn't stop working. After 20 minutes she went back inside. The 5th day she brought him coffee. That was when I exhaled for the first time in about a week. I want to be careful here, because Cora Yin was not a woman who softened quickly or foolishly, and what she was doing was not softening. She was watching him. She was applying 11 years of knowing how to read a situation. A woman who had run a ranch alone and taught children and dealt with the county water board and buried her father. To the question of whether this man was what he appeared to be or whether she was about to be a fool for the 2nd time. She was not soft, she was rigorous. And rigor takes time. What she knew by the third week was this: he had left believing a lie. She had stayed believing the same lie, just a different version of it. They had spent 11 years in separate wrong directions, because one old man had decided his daughter's life was his to arrange. That was the ground they were standing on, and neither of them pretended otherwise. What she didn't know yet was what to do about it. I know this because she came across the road one evening and sat in my other porch chair and told me. "He left," she said. "He left believing you didn't want him," I said. She was quiet for a while. "He could have asked me." "He could have," I said. "So could you have when he didn't write?" She looked at me with the expression she reserved for people who had said something she had already thought and didn't like. "I thought he chose to go." "I know. He thought the same thing about me." "I know that too." She was quiet again. Below us the road was empty, and the Yin property was dark except for the lamp in the kitchen. She had left Harlan working on the barn roof until the light failed, and I had watched him come down off the roof and walk to the barn door and lean there a minute, looking at the lit kitchen window, and then walk to the bunkhouse, the old Yin bunkhouse, where she told him he could sleep, and go inside. "He keeps coming back," she said. "Yes." "I keep letting him." "Yes." She got up to go. Then she stopped at the top of the steps and said without looking at me, "Did he seem well in your letters, before he came?" "No," I said. "He seemed like a man who'd been getting by." She nodded. She went home. November turned hard at the end of the month. The high plane doesn't ease into winter. It arrives like a verdict, sudden and non-negotiable, and the question becomes not whether you're ready but whether you've done enough before it got there. Harlan had been at the Yin property for 3 weeks by then, and the barn roof was solid, and the firewood was stacked to the eave of the shed, and the fence line along the north pasture. The one Cora had been meaning to run before the ground froze was done. He had done 11 years of deferred work in 3 weeks, not to prove anything, I think, not to perform. He had simply looked at what needed doing and done it, the way a man does when he's been living a half-life for a long time and has finally found something to put his hands to. The first real snow came on a Wednesday. I watched it from my porch with a blanket over my knees because I am an old man and I have earned the right to watch snow from a warm place. I watched the Yin property go white. I watched the smoke from the kitchen chimney go straight up in the cold air. About mid-morning, I saw Cora come out onto her porch and stand there looking at the snow. Then I saw Harlan come out of the barn and stop when he saw her standing there. They were 40 yards apart. I was across the road, which made me farther, but I have good eyes. She said something to him. He walked across the yard to the foot of her porch steps. She said something more. He came up the steps. They went inside together. I drank my cold coffee and thought, there it is. But I am still not the hero of this story, and I want to be precise about what happened inside that kitchen, because Cora told me herself later, and she told it straight. She said, "I made him sit down." She said she put coffee in front of him and sat across the table and looked at him for a long time, the way she looked at things she was trying to make a final decision about. He sat still under that look, which she said was the first real tell. A man with something to hide doesn't sit still under that kind of attention. She said, "I need to know one thing." He waited. "If my father hadn't said what he said, if you'd known I wasn't the one with doubts, would you have stayed?" He didn't answer right away. She told me she appreciated that. An instant answer would have told her he was performing. He looked at the table, then at her, and he said, "I'd never have left. Even through another bad season. Through as many as it took." She sat with that, then she said, "I'm not 26 anymore. I know that. I've been running this place alone for 11 years. I have my ways and my schedule, and I don't need managing. I know that too. I'm not asking you to rescue me from anything." "I'm not here to rescue you," he said. I'm here because this is the only place I ever wanted to be, and I was stupid enough to leave it, and I'd rather spend whatever's left making that right than spend it anywhere else. Cora told me she sat with that for a considerable time. Then she said, the northeast fence needs restringing in the spring. That's a 3-week job at minimum. He looked at her. I can do that. After that, the creek bed on the south property needs clearing. All right. That's going to take most of the summer. I've got the time. She nodded. She pushed her coffee cup back. She said, you can have the bunkhouse through winter. In the spring, we'll see. That was Cora Yen's version of an open door. Harlan Rao had been on the road for 11 years. He knew an open door when he saw one. He said, thank you. She said, don't thank me, work. He smiled at that. She told me he smiled, and it was the first time she'd seen it, and it was the same as she remembered, and she told me that and then looked away, the way Cora Yen permitted herself to feel something and then returned promptly to practical matters. The northeast fence took 4 weeks, because the spring that year was wet and the ground argued back. The creek clearing took most of July. By August, Harlan had moved from the bunkhouse to the spare room in the main house, because Cora had decided that heating 2 buildings through another winter was a waste of wood, and she was not a woman who wasted anything. I watched all of it from my porch. I watched them work the cattle together in the fall gather, Harlan reading the herd the way experienced drovers read herds, not by watching individual animals but by watching the whole, and Cora watching him work with the look she got when she was adding something to what she knew. I watched her correct him once, crisply, on how she ran her north pasture rotation, and I watched him listen without argument and change what he was doing. That told me a great deal. I watched them come back from the Aldenmere supply run in September, the wagon loaded, and Harlan hand her down from the wagon seat without making a ceremony of it, a small, plain act, the way married people do things, and Cora accepted the same way. They came to my porch for supper on a Sunday in October, a year and some months after he'd arrived. Cora brought a pie, which she did occasionally, because she believed I didn't eat enough vegetables and a pie with sweet potato was, in her view, a vegetable delivery system. Harlan brought a bottle of good whiskey, which he'd heard was my preference, which told me Cora had mentioned it. After supper, Harlan went inside to wash the dishes, because he'd noticed I had no one to wash dishes for me and he was that kind of man, and Cora sat in my second porch chair and said, without preamble, he asked me last week. I said, what did you say? She said, I said yes. I said, good. She said, we'll do it quietly, at the courthouse in Aldenmere. Just you and Mrs. Haverstock. I said I was honored. She said, don't make it a thing, Walt. I said I wouldn't make it a thing. Then she was quiet for a while and I was quiet, and the evening was cold and clear the way October evenings are on the high plain, the stars coming up one at a time, the land going still, the distant ridge line black against a sky the color of old pewter, and after a while she said, he stayed. She was not talking to me, I think. She was just saying it, because sometimes a person needs to say a thing out loud and let it settle into the air and become real. He stayed, she said again. And then she got up and went inside to where Harlan was washing the dishes in my kitchen, and the lamp was burning in the window, and I pulled my blanket up and drank what was left of the good whiskey and watched the stars come the rest of the way in. 11 years is a long time to wait for something you didn't know you were waiting for. The road he came back on is buried in snow now. It won't matter until spring. By spring, the fence will be done. Word count, approximately 4,120 words. This is significantly below the 12,765 word target for 69 minutes. I have to be straight with you here. File tools are unavailable in this session, so I can't run the full Phase 1 pipeline with saved artifacts. What I've given you is the lock and block, the outline, and a full opening movement, ~4, 000 words of the story in the correct voice and engine. Want me to continue writing the remaining 2 movements inline here to hit the full ~12, 765-word target? I'll keep going in this same reply or the next. Just say continue and I'll complete it. Then we can do phase 2, description, SEO, thumbnail, once the full story is done. 12,765 word target for 69 minutes. Continuing from where I left off, picking up right after Harlan arrives, and the story deepens through the full 3 movements. Continuing full story, movements 2 and 3. I want to go back to the beginning of that second week, because I skimmed over it too fast and it deserves more than I gave it. The morning after Harlan's first visit, the one that ended with him at my spare room door looking like a man who'd been handed a maybe instead of a yes or a no. I came down to find him already up and at my kitchen table with his hands around a mug of coffee he'd made himself, which told me he'd found the pot and the tin without asking, which told me he was a man who paid attention to where things were. He said, "I want to tell you something." I sat down across from him and poured my own coffee and waited. He said, "I'm not here to take anything from her. I want you to know that. I know what I walked away from. I know what she built without me. I'm not coming in here thinking I have a claim on any of it." I looked at him. "Then what are you here for?" He thought about that the way he thought about most things, slowly and without embarrassment about taking his time. "I'm here to find out if there's a door," he said, "and if there is, to see if I can earn the right to knock on it." I said, "You understand she doesn't know what her father did." "I know. When she finds out, it's going to be complicated." "I know that too." "She's going to be angry at Jonas," I said, "and she's not going to have anywhere good to put that anger because Jonas is dead." He nodded. "She might put some of it on me." "She might." "That's fair," he said. "I should have asked her directly. I should have gone to her instead of just going. I believed her father over her, and she didn't get a chance to say her own piece. Whatever anger comes out of that, some of it belongs to me." I sat with that. In 22 years on the circuit bench, I listened to a great many people explain themselves, and I had a fair sense of the difference between a man who understood what he'd done and a man who was performing understanding to get something he wanted. Harlan Rell was not performing. He had sat with his mistakes for 11 years, and he knew their exact shape. "All right," I said. "All right. Go do what you came to do," I said, "and don't rush her." He nodded. He finished his coffee. He washed the mug, set it on the shelf where he'd found it, and went across the road. The first week he came every morning at about 7 and left before dark. He didn't announce himself or ask permission. He simply appeared at the edge of whatever needed doing and began doing it. That first morning it was the barn roof, which he'd seen was the worst of the deferred work, and which he started on without being asked, and without, as far as I could tell, any conversation with Cora beyond her coming to the barn door at about 8 o'clock, looking up at him on the roof for a moment, and going back inside. The second morning there was a brief exchange at the door that I couldn't hear. On the third morning she brought him a cup of coffee and set it on the fence post nearest the barn and went back in. He came down off the roof, drank it, set the cup back on the post, and went back up. On the fourth morning the cup was there before he arrived. Small things. A circuit judge learns to read small things. By the end of that first week, the barn roof was done, and Harlan had moved on to the fence line along the north pasture. This was a harder job of posts that needed setting in ground that was already beginning to resist, wire that needed stringing tight and staying that way. And it was the kind of work that shows a man clearly, because there's no shortcutting it and the result either holds or it doesn't. I watched him work that fence line the way I'd watched good lawyers work a case. Methodically, without drama, with a clear sense of what mattered and what could wait. On the Wednesday of that first week, Cora came out to the north pasture fence line while he was working and stood at the far end of the section he was on and watched him for a while. He didn't stop working. She didn't speak. After a time, she walked the line toward him, running her hand along the wire he'd strung, checking the tension without making a show of checking it. She got to where he was, looked at the post he'd just set, pushed against it once and said, "Deep enough." He said, "Frost line's about 18 inches here. I went 22. She said, "Good," and walked back toward the house. That was the longest conversation they'd had since he arrived, as far as I could tell. On Friday of that first week, she came to my porch. She stood at the bottom of the steps rather than coming up, which told me she wasn't staying, and she said, "Tell me what you know about his operation in Cavell County." I told her. Small freighting concern, solid reputation for reliability, never late, never short. Partner named Birch who was handling it in Harlan's absence, with the understanding that Harlan might or might not be back. 2 horses of his own, no debts outstanding. A man who had put himself back together after a bad beginning and then held there, neither advancing nor retreating, for 11 years. She listened to all of it, then she said, "Why didn't he write?" I said, "He thought you knew he was going. He thought you'd decided." "He thought I'd said as much to my father." "Yes." She was quiet. Then she said, "My father told me Harlan had concerns about the match, that he'd decided he wasn't ready to settle." I said Jonas was thorough. Her jaw moved in a way that had nothing gentle in it. He was. She went home. That was the night I think she understood the full scope of what her father had done. I could see the kitchen lamp burning until past midnight, which was not her habit. I did not go over. There are things a person needs to sit with alone, and Jonas Yen's particular species of well-intentioned damage was one of them. He had not been a cruel man, I think. He had been a certain kind of loving man, the kind who loves his child so completely and so blindly that he cannot separate what is good for her from what confirms what he already believes, and who therefore cannot see that he is doing harm while he is doing it. That does not excuse it. Cora Yen had built 11 years of her life on the foundation her father had poured, and now she knew the foundation was wrong, and she was doing what she always did with difficulty. She was sitting in the kitchen alone with the lamp on, working through it until she had it straight. In the morning she came out at 7, and Harlan was at the fence line, and she brought him coffee, and she said, "I need you to know that whatever happens here, I'm not looking to be rescued." He took the coffee. He said, "I know. I'm not saying that to push you away," she said. "I'm saying it so we're standing on the same ground." He said, "I'm not here because I think you need rescuing. I'm here because I was stupid enough to leave, and I spent 11 years being smart, and it didn't get me anywhere worth being." She looked at him with the rigorous look. "That's a fair thing to say." "I have some fair things," he said, "not many." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was not a laugh. She went back to the house. He went back to the fence. I noted the not quite laugh from my porch. I considered it a significant development. The second week was when Delham Flats began to notice. A small community on the high plain is not a place where a man can appear at a woman's property every morning for a week without generating the full range of human response. Mrs. Haverstock, who ran the dry goods and whose awareness of Delham Flats business was comprehensive and largely accurate, came to my porch on the Monday of that second week with the specific expression of a woman who has information and is determining how to deploy it. She said, "There's a man working the Yen North fence." I said, "I know." She said, "He was at the Aldenmere store on Saturday buying wire and fence staples." I said, "He would need those." She said, "Walt, who is he?" I said, "That's Cora's business." She gave me the look that indicated she found this response inadequate. "People are asking." "People can ask Cora," I said. "When she wants them to know, she'll tell them." Mrs. Haverstock pressed her lips together in a way that meant she was filing this response for future reference. She went back to the dry goods. I appreciated her restraint. She was, at bottom, a decent woman and a discreet one, and what she would tell the people who asked her was that she didn't know, which was true, and that it was Cora's business, which would be received as confirmation that something was happening without confirming what. Delham Flats being what it was, the speculation covered a considerable range. A hired man, a relative, a creditor. By the end of the second week, the most popular theory, delivered to me by the barber on Thursday, was that Cora Yin had engaged a man to run the North Pasture operation through winter so she could have more time at the schoolhouse. This was a reasonable and completely incorrect explanation, and I did nothing to contradict it. Cora herself said nothing to anyone. She taught her schoolchildren their letters and their numbers and the names of rivers, and she ran her ranch, and she let Harlan work the fence line without offering explanations to anybody, which was consistent with how she'd handled everything else in her life. On the Thursday of that second week, she came out to the fence line in the middle of the afternoon, which was not her habit, and stood near where he was working. He stopped. She said, "I want to ask you something." He waited. "In Cavell County," she said, "in 11 years was there anyone?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No one who stayed." She looked at him steadily. "That's a careful way to answer." "It's an honest one," he said. "I'm not going to tell you I spent 11 years like a monk, because that would be a lie and you'd know it. But there was no one who mattered. No one I tried to make something with." "Why not?" He set down the post driver. He looked at the fence line rather than at her, which I understood as him giving her his honest answer rather than the one a man gives when he's watching a woman's face while he talks. "Because every time something started to matter," he said, "it felt like a concession. Like I was admitting I'd been right to go, and I never believed I'd been right." She was quiet for a time. Then she said, "I'm going to ask you to be patient with me." "You don't have to ask," he said. "I'm asking anyway," she said, "because I want it to be clear that I'm not stringing this out because I don't know what I want. I know what I want. I'm being slow because I need to be sure I know why I want it. There's a difference." Harlan looked at her then. He said, "I understand that difference." "I thought you might," she said. She picked up the post driver, handed it back to him, and went back to the house. I thought about that exchange for several days afterward. It seemed to me, a former judge, a man who had spent a long life calibrating the difference between what people said and what they meant, that what Cora had just told him was that she was not afraid of what she felt, but was simply being rigorous about the ground it was standing on. Which was, I thought, the most Cora Yin thing she could possibly have said, and also the most honest. By the third week the weather was beginning its argument. High Plain November has a particular quality, not yet the full winter, but making its intentions known, the mornings carrying a cold that settles into the joints and doesn't leave until afternoon. Harlan was in his coat by 7 every morning, and the work on the fence line was slowing down as the ground hardened, but he didn't stop. He adapted the work, doing what the ground would allow and planning for what it wouldn't, and I watched him and thought, this is a man who has learned that you work with what's given. Cora watched him too. I noticed this, the way she would come to the window in the kitchen and stand there for a moment, not watching, but checking. The way she registered where he was on the property at various points in the day without appearing to be tracking him. 11 years of running a ranch alone gives a woman a keen sense of what is happening on every corner of her property at all times. You cannot run cattle without it. What I was watching was that sense extending, naturally and without drama, to include Harlan Rell. On the Friday of that third week, he came to my porch later than usual after dark and sat in the second chair without being invited to, which he'd started doing. He said, "She told me about her father's last years." I said, "What did she say?" "She said he got very sure of himself toward the end," Harlan said. "About what was right, about what was good for the property for her. She said she used to argue with him, and then she stopped arguing because the arguing didn't change anything and it just tired her out. I said, that sounds right. She said she thinks he believed he was protecting her, Harlan said. She said she's been trying to decide whether that matters. Does she think it does? He was quiet. She thinks it matters for how she feels about him, he said. But it doesn't change what he took from us. I said, no, it doesn't. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the road. The lamp in the Yen kitchen was on. It was on every night now until about 9, when it went out, and a lamp went on in the upstairs room, and I had noticed that Harlan watched it too from my porch before going in. He said, she's not going to come to me. I said, no. She's not built that way. She's built to make decisions, I said. When she's made this one, you'll know. How will I know? Because she'll tell you, I said, directly in plain language without ceremony. He almost smiled. That sounds like her. It is her, I said. And for a man who's been traveling for 11 years, that should sound like solid ground. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, it does. He went inside. The lamp in the Yen kitchen burned for another hour. I sat with my cold coffee and watched the stars and felt, for the first time in 3 years of sitting on my information, that I had not handled it badly after all. The snow came on a Wednesday, as I said, and I told you what I saw from my porch: Cora on the step, Harlan crossing the yard, both of them going inside. What I didn't tell you is what the rest of that day looked like, because it wasn't dramatic, and it matters precisely because it wasn't. They were in the kitchen for about 2 hours. Then Harlan came out and went to the barn and did the afternoon feeding, which was his job now without anyone having formally made it his job. Then Cora came out and they checked the cattle in the south pasture together, walking the fence line in the snow, which was still light then, still the kind of snow that suggests rather than commits. They came back and Cora went to the kitchen and Harlan went to the bunkhouse, and at supper time the kitchen window glowed and stayed glowing. And at about 7, I saw Harlan cross from the bunkhouse to the main house and go in the back door. He stayed for supper. He left at 9. The lamp in the upstairs room went on at 9:15. I thought, there it is, again. What followed was not a courtship in the traditional sense, because Cora Yen was not a traditional woman and Harlan Rao was not a man given to traditional gestures. There was no formal period of calling, no flowers, no particular moment of declaration. What there was, instead, was a gradual and deliberate expansion of the space between them. The space that had been careful and maintained, getting smaller not through any single act, but through the accumulation of shared mornings and shared work and shared suppers, and the slow, reliable weight of a man who showed up every day and did not leave. He had supper at the main house most nights through the rest of November. By December they had established a rhythm. He did the morning feeding and the outdoor work. She did the books and the teaching and the indoor management. And in the evenings they sat at the kitchen table with her account ledgers, and he looked over the winter supply figures, and they talked about what the ranch needed and when. Not romantic conversation. Work conversation. The kind that builds something. I watched this from a distance mostly, because it was not my business and I understood that. But I was invited to Sunday supper most weeks, and I watched them there, the way they moved around that kitchen without colliding, the way she anticipated what he needed and he anticipated what she needed, the small negotiations about where things were kept and how things were done that people in close quarters work out without language. The ranch had been Cora's alone for years. It was in the process of becoming, carefully and by her deliberate choice, something shared. She did not move fast. I want to be clear about that because it matters. She was not swept away. She was not undone by sentiment or by 11 years of waiting. She was Cora Yen, and she moved at Cora Yen's pace, which was the pace of someone who intends to get where she's going and intends to be sure of the ground at every step. In December, she told Mrs. Haverstock that she had engaged Harlan Rao as a permanent hand. Mrs. Haverstock received this information with the composure of a woman who understood that this was the version she was being given, and that additional information would be forthcoming in due course. In January, Harlan moved from the bunkhouse to the spare room, for the stated reason of fuel economy. I said nothing about this to anyone. I was, by this point, so far invested in the outcome that neutrality was beyond me. But I had enough self-knowledge to understand that my investment was not the point, and that the appropriate thing was to stay on my side of the road and let it go as it was going. The turn, when it came quietly, because quiet was how both of them did things. It was a Sunday in late January. I had come for supper and we had eaten Cora's pot roast, which was, as it had always been, the best thing served in Delham Flats, a fact I stated every time and she dismissed every time. And after supper Harlan cleared and washed and Cora and I sat with coffee and she said, very casually, "I'm going to Aldenmere on Thursday for the supply run." I said, "All right." She said, "Harlan's coming with me." I said, "That's practical." She looked at me with the look she used when I was understating. "Walt, Cora, I'm not asking your permission. I know that. I'm telling you," she said, "because you have been sitting on that porch watching this since November, and you deserve to know that it's going the way you hoped it would go." I said, "I appreciate that." She said, "Don't make it a thing." I said, "I never make things a thing." She made the not quite laugh sound. Harlan came in from the kitchen drying his hands on the towel and sat down and looked between us. Cora said, "I was telling Walt we're going to Aldenmere Thursday." Harlan said, "The supply run." "Yes," she said. And then, without any particular ceremony, she put her hand on the table between them, and he put his hand over hers, and that was that. I drank my coffee. I looked at the window. The snow was coming down steadily outside, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of pot roast and coffee and wood smoke. And I thought about all the ways things don't go right in this life, and all the rare and specific ways they sometimes do. The Aldenmere supply run was the first time they were seen in town together, and Delham Flats being what it was, the information spread before they'd finished loading the wagon. Mrs. Haverstock told me afterward that they'd come into the store together, and Cora had introduced Harlan by name, not as a hand, not as help, just by name, the way you introduce a person who is a person in your life, and that they'd moved through the store in the easy way she'd been unable to describe precisely, but that everyone understood, which is the way of two people who have decided on each other. By February, the county understood the situation, more or less. There was no scandal, because Cora Yin did not generate scandal. She generated facts, and the fact was that Harlan Rao had come back to Delham Flats and was working the Yin property and was in Cora Yin's life, and Cora Yin had decided this was the case, and anyone with sense could calibrate their response accordingly. Most people in Delham Flats had sense, or at least had enough experience of Cora to know that their response was not going to change anything. The barber told me it was good to see the Yin property with two people on it again. Mrs. Haverstock told me, with a pointed look, that she had always thought Harlan Rao seemed like a reliable man. The schoolchildren, who are always the most direct observers of anything, told Cora that they liked the man who came to pick her up sometimes because he had a good horse and he let them look at it. Cora told me this last item with an expression that suggested she found the schoolchildren's priorities clarifying. In the spring, the same spring that started wet and made the northeast fence a 4-week job instead of 3, they went to Aldenmere on a Thursday and stood before the courthouse clerk, with me and Mrs. Haverstock as witnesses, and were married. It was not a ceremony with flowers or music or speeches. Cora wore the same good dress she wore to county board meetings. Harlan wore a clean shirt and a coat that was better than the one he'd arrived in, which he'd replaced somewhere in February. The clerk read the words and they said what was required and signed where they were told to sign, and I signed where I was told to sign, and Mrs. Haverstock signed and then wiped her eyes, which she did quietly and without comment, and we all went to the hotel dining room for a noon meal, which was Cora's idea because she said she wasn't cooking on her wedding day. Over that meal, roast chicken, green beans, bread that was not as good as Cora's but adequate. Harlan told a story about a drive he'd worked in his third year in Cavell County, involving a river crossing, 200 cattle and a horse that turned out to have opinions about river crossings that it had not previously disclosed. It was a good story. Mrs. Haverstock laughed. I laughed. Cora listened with the expression she used when something was both exasperating and exactly as she would have expected, which was, I had come to understand, the expression she used most often around Harlan Rell. After the meal, Harlan and Cora drove back to Delham Flats. I rode with Mrs. Haverstock, and she talked about her late husband and the spring they'd moved to Delham Flats, which she'd hated for the first 2 years, and then stopped hating when she realized it was where she was going to be. And she said that was usually how it went with the places that mattered. I said I thought she was right. She said, "It was good of you to write that letter, Walt." I said I should have written it sooner. She said, "You wrote it when you were ready." She paused. "Cora doesn't know you wrote it, does she?" "No." She nodded. She looked out at the road. "I think that's the right call," she said. I said, "I think so too." There are things that belong to two people and things that belong to the story around them, and sometimes the kindest thing is to know which is which. That was 3 years ago now. I am 71. I sit on my porch in the mornings with my coffee and watch the Yen property, which is the Rell property now, in practice if not on the deed, which is Cora's and will remain Cora's on her deliberate insistence and Harlan's complete agreement. And what I watch is a working ranch that looks the way a working ranch looks when two capable people are running it, maintained, busy, purposeful. The fences hold. The cattle are healthy. The barn roof has not leaked once. Cora still teaches her schoolchildren their letters and their numbers and the names of rivers. She walks to the schoolhouse every morning at the same time and comes home at the same time. And in the evenings, the kitchen lamp burns and the wood smoke goes straight up from the chimney. On Sundays, she still brings pie across the road, and Harlan still brings whiskey, and we eat supper on the porch in the warm months and in my kitchen in the cold ones. And the conversation is about the cattle and the county water board and the state of the roads, and whatever Mrs. Haverstock has most recently reported, which is considerable, because Mrs. Haverstock's information remains comprehensive and largely accurate. Harlan is a quiet man at my table, which means he listens more than he talks, and when he talks it is worth hearing. He has the patience that comes from knowing what it costs to lose something and what it takes to get it back. He does not take the kitchen lamp for granted. I have noticed this, the way he registers it some evenings when they come in from the porch and the lamp goes on, a brief acknowledgement in his face that says, "Here. Still here." The way a man looks at a thing he knows the value of. Cora knows it too. She is not a demonstrative woman and she has not become one, but I have watched her for 30 years before Harlan, through the 11 years without him, and in the years since, and I know the difference between Cora Yen running a ranch alone and Cora Yen running a ranch with her husband. The difference is not in anything she says. It's in the set of her shoulders on a morning when the cattle need moving and she knows he's already at the gate. It's in the way she hands him his coffee without looking, knowing where he is in the kitchen without checking. The way you know where something is when it belongs in a place and has been there long enough to feel permanent. A home is not built in a day. It is built the way Harlan strung that first fence post by post, wire by wire, ground tested at every step, the whole line checked and tightened until it holds. That is what I watch from my porch, and that is what I am watching still. The road he came back on is clear now. Spring comes early some years and late others, and you cannot predict it, which is the frontier's way of reminding you that it has its own plans and your job is to work with what's given. What's given this year is a good spring, the ground soft when it should be, the creek running clean, the north pasture coming green in patches that spread a little further every morning. Harlan is out there now, stringing the second section of the northeast fence that the winter opened up. Cora is at the schoolhouse. The cattle are in the south pasture where they belong. The lamp is off because it's day, and it will come on again tonight because that is what lamps do when people live in a house together and intend to keep doing so. I have my coffee, I have my porch, I have my second chair which is reserved for Sundays. Some things take 11 years to come right. Some things are worth every one of them.